Welcome, everybody. My name is Jill Yanch. I'm Director of Resilient Rurals. Resilient Rurals began as a partnership between the towns of Bruderheim, Gibbons, and Lamont, with the town of Bruderheim as lead. I work for the town of Bruderheim, and our purpose has been to develop a model around climate change adaptation and resilience, essentially create a model for small towns by small towns. And recently we've been focusing on food sovereignty. And so this is the third in our Cultivating Food Sovereignty webinar series. And I'm super excited today to share the space with my co-host, Derek Bruno, who will be the primary co-host or primary host today, and our presenter, Jacob Beaton with Tea Creek. I was lucky enough to travel with Derek to Jake's farm last summer to get a glimpse of the really incredible stuff that he's been doing there. So I know that today's going to be really informative and got some great things to chat about. So I'll let Derek and Jacob introduce themselves, but before we get started, just want to acknowledge my Resilient Rural staff, Danielle Hauk and Christina Fung. I'm super grateful for the work that they do and enable all the work of Resilient Rurals. So I'm going to pass it off to Danielle for the land acknowledgement, and then we'll get started.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am who you would have been communicating with to register for this event, so it's great to see you all here. And again, thank you for showing up. We're really excited to share this information with you. And also, I'm excited to hear what Jacob has to say. As long as I've been looking at the food sovereignty stuff, his farm was one of the first things I found in Canada and led to a lot of these webinars and whatnot, pursuing this knowledge sharing. So I'm very excited. So I'm coming to you from Treaty 8 territory today in Edmonton, which is the home to many, many different First Nations, including the Cree. The Dene have been here, and we have worked with plenty. I originally was raised in Treaty 7 territory. I was born in Calgary, and then I moved out towards Siksika. So this is more the Blackfoot and other Plains nations down there. And for a long time, I have always cared about the land. I grew up on a farm, and that really changed my relationship with how I relate to the land, because I saw not just what we can grow from this great country, but also what is already here and the diversity of plants and flowers and all the animals that are supported by that ecosystem down south. And I came up to Edmonton and I fell in love with the land here as well, including the people. And again, that diversity and the way that we can support. I have a garden on my own property here, and it just blows me away how fertile the land is here and what we can grow. And it blows me away how being connected to the land is critical to maintaining health and well-being and making sure we're eating good food and having good relations. And so I'm very happy to be here today. I'm very pleased to share this space with everyone and build relationships with both the Indigenous people who are native to these territories, as well as people who are newcomers and settlers to this region. I firmly believe in building these strong relationships because I believe this land is one that's worth sharing. And I know how important good relationships are to maintaining this beautiful space that many of us call home. So thank you again for joining us today. And I will pass it over to Derek to start the webinar.
Thank you so much. And just small correction, it's Edmonton's in Treaty 6. And
mistake, sorry guys.
That's okay. I also come from Treaty 6 territory. So Dante, the Scott no Gakio. It's always recommended by our elder. Well, our elders always tell us to try to start off every event speaking your language, and so I always greeted you in the Cree language. It's great to see each and every one of you. I'm from the Samson Cree Nation, and I'm the managing partner of SevGen. And the work that I've been doing the last number of years is bridging the gap between municipalities, First Nations, and corporations. I find that one of the most critical points of this idea of reconciliation happens between neighbors. You know, more so than, say, our relationships with the province or even with the feds. I always say neighbors, you know, folks that, you know, live in a region together, that are, you know, trying to raise their kids in a region together. Those are the critical points that I find are the best places to have dialogues like this. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jacob, and then I'm going to get Jacob to introduce himself. But for my introduction of him, I just want to talk a little bit about our history. Jacob and I've known each other for decades, and one of the unique things about Jacob is that he was one of the original youth entrepreneurs in this country who built a successful IT company out on the West Coast. And so, you know, being one of the only youth entrepreneurs back in our day here in Alberta, that was Indigenous First Nations, we got to meet each other on the trail, and it's just been so fantastic to see where Jacob has taken his career, and you know, and really to hear his story today of what brought him to where he's at now. And I do apologize if I cough here and there. I'm just getting over a cold. Same with Jill. So we're pushing through it. So Jacob, with no further ado, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Derek. Yeah, good memories. Young Indigenous entrepreneurs. So yeah, my name is Jacob. My name is also Japafgatwinskik. In our language, it means busy eagle, or a compulsively building eagle is actually the accurate translation of my traditional name. It was given to me quite a few years ago based on how I've been living my life, which is somebody who's an entrepreneur and likes to get things done and kind of can't sit still. You know, that's how I have to compulsively do things, solve problems. So I've prepared a slideshow, and I'm going to just jump into that right now because, like, the territory I'm in and things like that are probably better visually shown than verbally explained. So without further ado, I'm just going to switch my screen over, or share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to hit play here. So yeah, thanks to Resilient Rurals and Derek and Jill and team for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to come to you over Zoom. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about Indigenous food sovereignty, our interpretation of it, how we're doing things at Tea Creek. And first of all, I just want to let you know kind of where we are and a little bit of the history. So we're coming to you from Gitxsan territory in the northwest of what's now British Columbia. It's been quite the journey the last few years. So we won the BC Land Award in 2022 for what they call food lands, so agricultural food producing lands. I was keynote speaker at the BC Agriculture Show last a year ago, the biggest ag show in the province. And then I also been able to speak to the Senate, the Canadian Senate, Standing Committee on Agriculture, and then just a few weeks ago, the BC Legislature Standing Committee on Agriculture. And anyways, the list is long. I kind of I'm shocked. I suffer some imposter syndrome, you know, like I didn't seek this out, like the kind of profile and attention. I just kind of was solving local problems as I saw them, and it turned out it's quite innovative and is getting a lot of attention. Probably one of my biggest highlights from this was dropping by COPE in Montreal last year, late 2022, I guess it would have been. And I was just in my Carhartts, and I just wanted to be a fly on the wall for the Indigenous caucus meeting. And I walked in, and the organizer was like, "You're Jacob Beaton, you're Tea Creek." And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "You're our opening speaker." I'm like, "What? No, I'm not." She's like, "Yeah, you are." We didn't know you'd be here, but now that you're here, you're our opening speaker. So that's pretty hilarious. So the photo on the bottom right is me and my Carhartts speaking to a room full of Indigenous leaders from around the world in Montreal. It's very humbling and very cool experience. So we are located here. This is like a climate map of a climate region map of Canada. We're a really special geographic location and a really special cultural location for Indigenous peoples. We are at the meeting point between, as you can see, two major climatic regions, the coast and the interior. We also, what's not shown here on the map is the 12.3 zone, that the subarctic zone actually extends down here into our valley. We're the last point, geographic point of the zone. So we have three overlapping major climate zones here. So it's incredibly biodiverse, and a lot of our training and teachings are relevant to nations and cultures from those different climate regions. And we're not as remote as you think. Like that's one of the challenges. We don't have this with First Nations, that we have it with like mainstream people who are kind of clustered in cities and down near the border. They think we're in the middle of nowhere. We're actually not. Like we're an hour, there's 6 flights a day from Vancouver, from 2 different airlines, so like 12 flights a day from Vancouver to Terrace, and we're an hour drive outside of Terrace. So probably not the worst commute you've ever heard of. And then same from Calgary. There's like 6 flights a day from Calgary, and we're like an hour drive, right? So it's not as remote as you think we are. We're not like, I don't have to take there's no float planes or canoes involved in the commute to Tea Creek. So we started farming back in 2019. So I haven't been farming for very long. When I purchased the farm, I had to purchase it cash. Being First Nations status, Indian, it's really tough to get mortgages still today, nearly impossible. Doesn't matter how good your credit is. So bought this old farm and got it up and running. And our plan was just to quietly homestead, off in the back country without any attention at all. What I didn't realize is that by buying land, being a First Nations person and buying farmland, is essentially an act of resistance. So it turns out I'm the first Indigenous person in our valley, in our region, to buy land, farmland back and farm it. So it was like a lightning going through the First Nations, like, wow, an Indigenous person's farming again. Like, and I'll talk about that a little more in the future. So we started getting people coming to us in our first year from far away. Like we had a high school, First Nations high school, drive hundreds of kilometers just to come see our farm. It was pretty crazy. So I'm going to go through a little bit of a history lesson first, and just so we're all on the same page before we have discussion, I want to explain some of the language I'm going to be using, and just so we're on the same page and we can understand each other. So I'm going to start with our vision at Tea Creek. So our vision is healthy, resilient Indigenous communities and economies based on abundant local food. This is nothing new. Like this is our past. So I like to say our past is our future again, and I'll explain that a little more in the following slides. But the whole idea here is that the health of communities and economies is really around food. When we, especially in the growing uncertainties of the world, local food security and food production is becoming more and more important. So when I say agriculture, what I want to talk about what Indigenous agriculture and food is and how we define it. So it's the stewarding of ecosystems that promotes food production. That's how we see it. So if you're plowing and tilling and sowing seeds and growing food, or you're pasturing animals, like you're stewarding an ecosystem and you're producing food. And then for Indigenous peoples, it extends well past that into forest preservation, so that you have wild game to harvest. It's protecting watersheds, so you have salmon or trout, or water-based foods. It's ocean stewardship, so that you have all the seafoods available. So for us, it's aquaculture, and it's a silviculture, and it's all these other things is agriculture to us, because it isn't just a tree, it's an ecosystem that produces food. That's how we see it. So it's intentional production of food in many different ways across all of these different things that I just mentioned. And when Indigenous looks at food production, they naturally include food sovereignty principles, which leads me to the next slide, which is what is the difference between food security and food sovereignty? Because they're not interchangeable, they're very different. And yet I hear people interchange them like, oh, food sovereignty is a sexier term now, so let's just switch to using food sovereignty. But food sovereignty actually comes from Indigenous people in South America. That's where the food sovereignty movement started globally, was Indigenous people in South America. It then moved to Indigenous people in Africa, where it was then elevated to the United Nations through what they call the Mali Declaration in Africa. And food sovereignty is about rights. It starts with the rights of people to make their own decisions about food. So it's about policy, it's about rights, land rights, human rights. Seed sovereignty is part of food sovereignty, for example. It's about valuing knowledge holders, knowledge keepers, working with the land instead of against the land, decreasing your reliance on outsiders, like trying to be sovereign, like that's food sovereignty. So the way I describe food sovereignty is it is like it's your vision, and food security is part of it. So food security is part of food sovereignty, but it's definitely not food sovereignty, because the way that food security works is it's like it's food wealth. So like how much food do you have in your pantries and in your freezers and accessible to you? It's a measure of how many days you can go without going to the store to buy food. That's food security. So people who don't have enough food for a day in their household are very food insecure, right? Like they maybe are down to 1 or 2 meals a day. That's food insecurity. Or maybe they only have a week's worth of food, you know, and the highway gets shut down because of wildfires, and they start starving after a week. So they're food secure for 1 week. So food security is a measure essentially of how much money you have in your bank account. Food sovereignty is about how you get that money in your bank account. So hopefully that makes sense, and let's move forward. The current problem, so this is what we're seeing here, is that farmers are declining in Canada. So this is one of the problems. And it's staggering. So I just read a report in 2023 that says that Canada is losing food producers, 5 to 7 food producers a day across the country. Here in the province of British Columbia, farmers are declining about 10% every 4 years. So and nationwide, it's like 9%. It's very, very high. And that's why the Royal Bank came out with that study last year, raising the alarm bell, saying the food production industry of Canada is going to collapse in 10 years unless there's some major intervention, because this is not sustainable loss. Less than 1% of food producers in Canada currently are Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. So this is something I learned when I was at the COPE conference, and it's widely accepted data that's been studied and proven globally, and that is that 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity rests in Indigenous controlled lands. I'm just trying to advance the slide here. There we go. Which makes up 20% of the world's land. So all that biodiversity, that 80%, is in 20% of the world's land mass. So Indigenous people, this is what I learned at the COPE conference, are currently carrying 32% of the world's goals in fighting climate change on less than 1%, a fraction of 1% of the world's financial resources. So climate change, you know, BC, you know, the whole country's feeling it, obviously, you know, food producers and people everywhere are feeling the pinch of droughts and fires and floods and etc. So here in BC, you know, the lower mainland got flooded out, Abbotsford, all the highways got shut down, other than the only way we could get food 2 years ago was through Alberta, actually, Highway 16. Or through one of the highways to the United States. So it was pretty crazy. And then last year it was wildfires, again, impacting food production, food systems, food distribution. So now I want to talk a little bit about our rich history of food sovereignty. And this is the part of the presentation. If I'm presenting to Indigenous people, it's usually go through it pretty quickly because we get it. But non-Indigenous people, I need to go a little more slowly often because sometimes this is new information. So the first really important fact is that Indigenous peoples were food sovereign plus. Like Indigenous cultures around what's now called North America were incredibly rich in food technology at the time of contact with Europeans and food production there. And we learn about it in, our elementary school, like how Indigenous people saved the first Europeans from starvation and taught them how to produce food and preserve food through the winter and all of that. There's lots and lots and lots of evidence, and it isn't just in what's now Ontario, kind of where the history books focus on. It was over the whole continental landmass and all of North, Central, and South America. So, for example, we have here a 2,000-year-old fishing weir that is up here in the north, on the coast, and it's one of the most advanced fishing technologies for the time, 2,000 years ago. And then here's photos of the Nisga'a, which are a nation near me here, who were incredibly wealthy based off their food production industries. Like they had factories, guys. Like they were producing and exporting an absolute abundance of seafood to hungry Europeans who valued it and paid good money for it. So this is an interesting fact. Many of the world's most valuable crops were cultivated by Indigenous peoples over thousands of years of intentional agriculture. So corn, which is in the top 2 of the world's produced crops, was developed, which is a crop that should have happened. It's so difficult. I watched a science video on this. We find it so interesting, where for corn to become a crop 10,000 years ago, it had to be developed hand in hand with a chemical process to make it digestible. And it's one of the things that still dazzles scientists today. Like, how did people even figure this out that long ago? So we have corn, we've got squash, we've got beans, 80% of the world's edible beans. Like when Christopher Columbus crashed into the Caribbean islands, he arrived at the Taino, which were a nation of 6 million people, and they were bean exporters. That's how they made their money, is they were bean farmers, peaceful bean farmers. That's who they were. So they weren't like tribal jungle dwellers. They were field farmers. And if you look at some of those early accounts, that's what they describe, people out there working in their fields. Same thing in Australia. The Indigenous Australians were incredible, insane field farmers before Europeans arrived. All over the world. Definitely the same thing here in our part of the world. So this is something called the Columbian Exchange. That's what modern scholars call it, based on Christopher Columbus. So you have all of these indigenous advanced food technologies and crops going over to Europe in the 1500s, 1600s. And then you have these European-based, rest of the other side of the world, old world crops coming over to the Americas as part of what they call the Columbian Exchange. And the reason I point this out is a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people don't recognize Indigenous people as being advanced agriculturists. They recognize them as being hunter-gatherers and primitives, which is completely 100% false. And it's false pretty much anywhere you go in North America. So up here, for example, the keystone species for animal species was elk and deer in the Gitxsan territory. Elk and deer are they're not foragers. They eat grass. There's no grassland here anymore. It's all forest. And so people look at it and go, oh, Indigenous people here lived in the forests, which is hilarious because they were actually field food producers here who were forced off their land, and the settlers didn't keep up the fields. And the forest came in, and now there's no elk, no deer, and tons of moose. So people say, oh, they were forest dwellers who hunted moose. Completely false. You go back even just 100 years and look at the European accounts from 100 years ago, and there's tons of them, and they describe cultivated fields abundant in deer and elk only 100 years ago. So we got to look at the true history here. If we're going to have a real conversation about Indigenous food production and agriculture, we have to stop looking at food production as a European thing. It's not. It's a global thing, and it's an Indigenous thing. And Indigenous peoples were highly advanced in agriculture prior to contact, post-contact, and up to 150 to 100 years ago. So I like to say Indigenous peoples were and are agrarian, in the sense that agrarian means food producers cultivating ecosystems, not necessarily just field producers, but food producers of all kinds from all different types of ecosystems. So Indigenous peoples adapted really well and really quickly in Canada and in the prairies, especially. They were out-competing settlers in agriculture in the 1800s. This was not considered acceptable by settlers who were promised free, easy land. And so there was this big pushback against this Indigenous domination of food production. It was here in BC too. Indigenous landowners were ranching tens of thousands of acres in British Columbia and were incredibly wealthy. So one of the photos on the previous slide was one of those ranchers who's the equivalent of a many multimillionaire in today's money. Him and his family ranched 20,000 acres here in BC, and it was all stolen as soon as they started dying. The government came and stole it and auctioned it off for pennies to the dollar, including all of the animals, including all the different herds. So how did this happen? Well, this is how it happened: is Indian Act 1876, and then there's these major policies that were born out of the prairies lobby, settler lobbies. So that's severance policy. So you weren't allowed, if you're First Nations, you're an Indigenous, you weren't allowed to own more than 20 to 50 acres of land on or off of an Indian reserve. So if your family has a 20,000 acre ranch, well, that now gets reduced, if you're lucky, to 20 to 50 acres, and the rest is taken away. That's severance. Peasant policy forbade Indigenous people from purchasing any technology for use in food production. So here it evolved into First Nations people not being allowed to put motors in their boats anymore. So they had motor boats, and then they were only allowed to use rowboats. Peasant policy meant you weren't allowed to buy tractors, tractor attachments, etc. You were only allowed to hand farm. So that's peasant policy. And then the last one that was the latest and the most devastating was pass and permit. So all these other things came into place, and Indigenous people kind of found workarounds. You know, like, well, I'm not allowed to buy a tractor, so my settler friend, who's my neighbor, he'll buy the tractor for me and just give it to me. You know, we're not allowed to have more than 20 to 50 acres, so we'll just collectively join our little 20 to 50 acres together and work together. So pass and permit was designed to kind of be, you know, the final nail in the coffin, where you weren't allowed to leave an Indian reserve without permission. You weren't allowed to buy things at a store off reserve without a letter of permission. You weren't allowed to sell any of your product to anybody, including other Indigenous peoples. So that's pass and permit. So it's really draconian and devastating. And unfortunately, these policies worked. You know, we have now today, where I am here, you know, no Indigenous farmers, zero. We have, if you go back in the previous slides, less than 1% of Canadian food producers are currently Indigenous, even though we make up 5% of the population. It's not even close to proportional anymore. So those impacts are felt. And it's not quite the final nail. The final nail is Indian residential schools, which, you know, breaks the passing of food knowledge and other knowledge, cultural and everything, you know, just family, culture, everything that's really important. It breaks that. So that's really here. What happened is you still had these little family gardens really producing a lot of food on these tiny lands just on their own, not able to sell it, but at least they're food sovereign. This is what took that away. You know, when you're no longer allowed to teach your children what you know in the way that you know, and work together in a healthy way, food systems and many systems break down. So now let's talk about the modern day reality. So going back to pass and permit, I was actually talking to the owner. So when I got a tractor, so I bought a tractor, it was part of the excitement because, again, first Indigenous, First Nations person in our area to have a tractor. And a very like outside of people's memories, right? So it's super exciting. I talked to the owner of the tractor dealership, you know, who we have a really good relationship with, and he said, yeah, I remember. Like, it's in his lifetime. He said, yeah, I remember needing a letter of permission to sell First Nations people a tractor. So, but what about today? So yeah, I can go buy a tractor today, you know, cash. So Indigenous projects today have to do 25 times more paperwork for the same dollar. And this is based on a study by a very large Canadian foundation that shared the results with me, and they audited their own programs and the programs of other foundations and funds across the country. And this is what they came up with, is that if you're non-Indigenous versus Indigenous for the same program, the same dollar, you have to do 25 times as much work. And often, this is the crazy thing, you often don't get your money up front. So we applied our first ever program. It was a federally funded, and we signed a contract, and it was a COVID-based program, and we were supposed to get an upfront payment in order to hire and train people, Indigenous people. They literally tore up the contract once they found out I was First Nations. I'm not even joking. They rescinded the contract, canceled it, and replaced it with a new Indigenous contract, which was a reimbursement repayment system. So we had to spend the money, send in the claims with all the proof that we'd spent the money, which we did. And I remember we were 5 cents off on our claim for like over $100,000. And they rejected it because we were 5 cents off. So we had to spend a week and a half combing through every single transaction to 5 or 5 cents, our clerical error, you know, like accidentally hitting a 9 instead of a 5 on your number pad. So that's the reality of being Indigenous. If you're not Indigenous, here's the money, 250 grand up front. Go hire people, go train people, have fun. You're Indigenous, it's like, well, you got to have $250,000 in your pocket, spend it, send in every single receipt, make a clerical error, and it nearly bankrupted us. Like that's the reality, folks. So here's another reality. Indigenous peoples currently make up 0.6, not 6%, 0.6% of board seats, like governance in the country, and only 0.4% of senior management positions in the country. And this is based on Corporations Canada 2023 report. And I quote from the report, there were increases of minorities in all categories except Indigenous people. So you have more women, you have more visible minorities. Every year it's been increasing in Canada in these senior positions, and Indigenous people has not been increasing year over year. So we're flatlined. That's the fact, that's the data. So last thing I'm going to say here on some of the problems that we're facing is financing. I've mentioned that before. It's a real issue, especially if you're First Nations and status Indian like I am. I'll tell you a really quick story that if you're a farmer, you might, you know, kind of get this. So as I mentioned, we ended up buying our farm cash. I sold my previous business and got some money and bought the farm. So I went to one of our major banks, that's the biggest farm lender. And I said, hey, I've got this business plan. I really want to blow this thing up. I want to do this cool stuff. And they're like, yeah, sounds great. And so I submitted, and they got me a call back, and they're like, you're First Nations. I said, yes. They said, we don't do First Nations agricultural lending. I was like, what? like what? And they're like, yeah, sorry, it's a blanket policy. Like, if we do agriculture, absolutely, but not First Nations. I was like, but I've got excellent credit. I own everything. Like, I'm a farmer. I've got agricultural land, reserve land. Like, they're like, sorry. So I appealed it all the way to the top, like provincial office, national office. And this is where we need to talk about institutionalized racism, because this is what we're talking about, is you have all those laws that I mentioned, those policies, those federal policies that are no longer enforced. Oh, I got to mention, by the way, any guesses when pass and permit was repealed? Go ahead, drop it in the chat. When pass and permit was repealed in Canada, give you a second to guess, even in your heads. 2014 pass and permit was repealed. So this is when you see in the news institutionalized racism, you're like, what? I'm not racist. We can't possibly have institutionalized racism. This is what institutionalized racism looks like, is the banks and financial institutions used to not be allowed to lend money to First Nations. They've been allowed to lend money to First Nations for a very long time now. So they still say no. And they don't really know why anymore. It's just embedded in the whole fabric of the institution. Everybody is just like, yeah, we just don't do it because you're First Nations, and for no other reason. It doesn't matter how good your credit is. It doesn't matter how awesome you are. It's just like, you are First Nations. You do not pass go. You do not collect $100. That's institutionalized racism. So when I talked to the senior national people at this institution, I said, why? Like, why are you still saying no? And they quoted me the most ridiculous, nonsensical reason. I won't even say it here because it doesn't matter. It was complete and utter nonsense. And I called them out on it, right? So anyhow, you've got these things like the CALA loans, Canadian Agricultural Loans Act. Almost all the CALA loan money goes to non-Indigenous people because the policies that they still have or have had within these institutions are anti-First Nations and anti-Indigenous, and people don't even know why anymore. So we had 3 different nations come to us from the prairie provinces last year wanting to get involved with Tea Creek. And one of them has a massive reserve, base with many tens of thousands of acres. And they told me that they don't have a single Indigenous First Nations farmer farming any of their agricultural land. They're all non-Indigenous because they can't get CALA loans. So all the non-Indigenous people can lease reserve land and get a CALA loan, but you can be a First Nations person from that treaty land, that reserve land, and you can't get a CALA loan for your own land. That's how Canada is right now. So what happens? So yeah, I just dropped some stuff on you, and I hope you're still okay and still with me and you haven't hung up the phone. But I want you to know the truth, because the truth is critical. Like if we're going to have a meaningful conversation about working together, you need to know the truth, because otherwise you're going to come in with all kinds of ideas and advice that is just not going to work. So you need to know what our situation is, so that the conversation can be constructive. So what happens now? So I'm going to talk about our success story here at Tea Creek. We're going to pick ourselves up and go, okay, here's a cool story. So Tea Creek is, first of all, we're land-based. So we do everything as possible outdoors. We don't have an indoor classroom per se. We are Indigenous-led. So this makes us really unique, is that, last year, our staff of 30 people was 90% Indigenous. And Indigenous at every level. So going back to that slide about Indigenous leadership and the lack of it in this country, we are the opposite. So we make sure that there's a majority Indigenous at every single level of our organization, so that the test of Indigenous-led is that a majority of decisions at every level, every day, are made by Indigenous people. That's what Indigenous-led means. That's the definition we're fleshing out. It's not enough to say you've got an Indigenous figurehead who goes to meetings and makes speeches, or some low-level Indigenous workers serving coffee. Indigenous-led means majority of decisions every day made by Indigenous people at every level, and that makes us unique. We're culturally safe. This also makes us very unique. So what this means is, number one priority is that you are safe as an Indigenous person to come to our site, safe in every way. But culturally safe is really, really important to us, meaning you're not going to face racism. You're not going to be expected to suddenly become non-Indigenous in some way. You're allowed to be yourself at whatever level you're at in yourself, and that you'll be in a supported environment. This is the model we came up with a number of years ago, based on my previous businesses and experience around economic development. Okay, so what are the 4 main areas you'd need to run like a healthy local economy? And this is what we came up with. So first area is administration. So you need people who can plan, who can project manage, who can supervise, do HR, payroll, be entrepreneurs, that kind of thing. The next quadrant is, we call them the builders. So people who can build things with their hands. You know, they're your carpenters, mechanics, plumbers, machine operators. Next section is growers, like people who handle food. So you need your food producers of all kinds, right? And then the last one, and this is an interesting one, and maybe, you know, I think we can all kind of get it. We call it nutrition and hosting. So these are the people who do like take care of folks. You know, they show up on a site and you're like, get welcome, you get offered a cup of coffee, you get oriented. You know, culturally we call them like our aunties and uncles, right? Like the people who are like, oh yeah, come on in, now have a seat. Are you hungry? Here's some food. You know, what's going on in your life? So yeah, that's kind of like a quadrant that I think isn't often acknowledged, but we recognize that, you know, the way we operate as Indigenous people wouldn't be there without these people who can do this. And we have to actually train people. We have a lot of people who are really quiet and they find their voice, and you have to have a voice in order to play those roles. So our Tea Creek model is something that is called a holistic model, in like little quote marks. So what that means is we're not education, we're not health, you know, we're not food security, we're not governance, you know, we're not skills training, we're not land protection. We're all of it, all of it together, and it really is integrated. Like we do everything every day, pretty much all the time. And it's been nuts. It's been totally crazy. So we started in our first program essentially started at the end of 2020, but we were prototyping and doing stuff back in 2019 when people just started showing up, right? Like just started showing up, Indigenous people. So what happened is back in, I think, 2019, First Nation, I mentioned like a high school came to our farm, a couple different schools. Pretty soon the word spread, and a nation that's like, you know, an hour's drive away contacted us and said, hey, can we bring our people to your farm? Sure, you know. So they came and they just joined us for a regular day of farming. Got to the end of the day and we did a circle around the fire, and they said, this was the most amazing day we've ever had. Like, we've learned so much, we feel so good. And they were like, we'll pay you to do this, because we pay other institutions, like non-Indigenous people institutions, to train us and to host us, and we pay an insane amount of money. They told me how much money they pay, and I almost fell over. I was so shocked. And so I put it at the back of my mind, like, okay, that's a business, you know, like I can do a better job than what they're receiving right now from mainstream institutions and companies. But I've got this other business that's doing really well, so I'm not going to do it. So 2020 happens. Guess what happens in 2020, right? Like pandemic, COVID, my other business, I can't really do it anymore. And so I switched gears. I'm like, hey, I think I'll do this land-based First Nations education training. So that's how it started. Boom, you know, it just went through the roof and still is. So the next slide here is a little more detailed. So I want to show you, first of all, how much funding, where our funding's been at the last few years. So what happens is we're primarily funded through post-secondary education. So we get paid to give people post-secondary education training. And in our first year, it came from multiple different sources, like small amounts of money, kind of piece it together. Second year, same thing. Last year, we've actually got a contract directly from the province. And you can see we've managed to increase our funding every year. Well, the next slide here is the actual students, numbers of students we've had enrolled. So we've had, you can see 2022 was particularly difficult in terms of how much funding we had versus how many students. 2023, we managed to get our funding up, but we still had double the enrollment as we had funding. So 2023, we were pieced together funding for 150 students, and we had 300 Indigenous enrollments. Now that's pretty impressive, but on top of that, we have a whole bunch of people who aren't officially enrolled, like for long-term training. They come for like a one-day workshop, they come, you know, with a school class for a day, or the elders come and hang out for a day. And so how many people is that? Well, this is how many Indigenous people on top of our enrollments, guys. Like, this is not, you Yeah, so it's like it's a poppin' place. It's very, very busy, and it's all word of mouth. Like we don't do any magazines or pamphlets or posters. There's no posters of Tea Creek anywhere. It's all word of mouth, and of course we can barely keep up with it. So what are we doing? Like, so that's some of the wins. Like, what's the plan here? So our plan right from the beginning was to create Tea Creek as an Indigenous agriculture leadership training center. So I think of it as like Tea Creek University. That's what we'd like to become. We have become Canada's first designated Indigenous horticulture training center. Huge win. So one of the blocks in front of us for funding was like, hey, you need to be an official school. So we applied through this program through skilled trades to become a designated horticulture training center, and we achieved it. We actually got 100% on the inspection, and they said we're the most prepared site they'd ever seen. So that's pretty cool. And the whole idea here is that the model, like a lot of First Nations want to copy Tea Creek. They want their own version of Tea Creek, and we want that too. But it's really hard to do without funding. It's really hard to do without adequate facilities. But once we have that, then we can deploy, we can start bringing people in, come get your degree at Tea Creek University, come for a few years, get your degree, and then you go back to your nation and implement it. Second thing is we're building a network, because we want a really good understanding. So that less than 1% of Indigenous food producers, who are they, where are they, who wants to be a food producer, Indigenous food producer, we want to know. And we want to know, like, how big's your vision? How much money do you need? Where are you at? How much more money do you need? Because we want to start unlocking financial resources for Indigenous-led, authentic Indigenous projects, right? Indigenous-led means authenticity. And I've got some bad news. So we've done 2 surveys that were funded by the Provincial Ministry of Agriculture. And so that less than 1% in BC anyways, I can only speak for BC, and but I suspect is similar. More than 70% of projects are micro scale. So they're basically community gardens. They're producing less than 10,000 pounds of food of any kind per year. So it's a small minority that's even at like a small scale, and an even smaller that's at like a commercial or medium or large scale production. So yeah, we can pat ourselves on the back going, well, at least there's more than 0%, but the folks who are out there, we're really struggling. We're really, really small, and there's just a ton of insane barriers that keep us small. So one of the things that we see with this network is we need to start creating standards and tools that unlock money resources for First Nations, so that there's a replacement for all of the destructive policies of the past that worked and were designed to destroy Indigenous food systems. We now need the remedies to that, and we have the remedy. The remedy is Indigenous-led and funding that. Okay, the last thing, and I'm just about done, and I wish I was paying attention to time. I've probably gone on way too long, but just going to hit to my last slide here. So the third thing we're working on, and we've been actively fundraising around, is creating toolkits to make the model replicable. So there are very few Indigenous voices in this. Like when I'm teaching agriculture and let's say it's pouring rain out, we want to watch a video. There's very, very, very essentially zero content from Indigenous voices on all the million different topics there are to cover in food systems and food production. So we want to create those voices. We want toolkits. We want them to be online. We want them to be accessible to Indigenous peoples. And we essentially want to be able to scale very quickly to have tens of thousands of Indigenous people to be job ready, production ready, entrepreneurship ready, so that they can go to the bank and get a loan and buy your farm, right? Like if you're one of those farmers exiting, like, hey, wouldn't it be great if a young Indigenous person could buy it from you? And because they got a lot of fire in their belly for this. And I can tell you from experience, like the amount of Indigenous people coming to us is just off the charts. You've seen it. And we're just one tiny little region of the world. And the amount of hunger there is in Indigenous people to get back to our culture of food, producing an abundance of food, is really powerful. So that's what we see here is unlocking those pathways. And so a lot of my work when it comes to mainstream presentations and talking to folks, it's like, we need policy changes. Policy changes are easy. They're so easy. We're not asking even for legislative changes. We're just asking for, hey, those people at the top of those banks to reverse those policies that they currently have that lock out First Nations from borrowing food, borrowing money to farm or ranch or produce food. That's a policy shift, and it can happen really quickly. So I will wrap up the story with that bank, that institution, which I will not name. I've stopped naming them, and this is why. Is, I went to the Senate and I talked about how terrible they are, my experience, and they have since done major policy reversals and instituted an all Indigenous farm lending team that I've since met with, and they're really trying to change things. And that's a policy shift, folks, and that's less than 1 year. Okay, so like it can happen, and people in power who are non-Indigenous at this point, you can see that in the data, can choose to take reconciliation action and turn this around. Like, it can turn around overnight through policy shifts. So that's about it. I mean, I've got lists of things we need, but I think this is probably the wrong audience for this. I did this presentation deck for the Assembly of First Nations, and we're fundraising for a million different things right now. If you want to support us, probably the easiest way is on our website. There's an endorsement link right at the very top. You can click it and enter in why you think we're important, why it's important that Tea Creek continues to exist and hopefully grows. And if you need to go to our website, it's teacreek.ca, and there's a QR code that'll take you straight to it. So thanks for listening. I know that was a long one. Yeah, there's a lot to say, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jacob. Wow, what an incredible presentation, and I can certainly listen to you all day. Coming from Alberta, certainly many of the things that you've pointed out resonate here as well. I think about my reserve of Samson. My father tried his hand at farming, the traditional farming, same thing, like he had to cash flow everything. When I started my business, I had same experience going to the banks and hear them say, "Mr. Bruno, we can't lend you money because you're an Indian." And I'm like, "What's that have to do with anything?" And they said, "Well, it's the Indian Act, which is still in place today." And I think like that's the great thing about your story, is being able to connect the dots to say, when you have certain legislation or policy, you're going to get a certain result. And so we shouldn't be surprised when we see the poverty in communities, when we see the frustration. Anybody that can connect those dots can go, well, yeah, I mean, absolutely, we're going to see more of it. We're going to see more homelessness. We're going to see more food insecurity, across this nation. And so that's why I think stories like yours are so important. So I want to open it up to the group here for anybody who has any questions about the presentation thus far. So.
Cara did have her hand up. I'm not sure if she still has a question or not.
Okay. Sorry, I don't see any hands.
I have a question. Thank you so much for that, Jacob. I feel like every time I chat with you, I learn so much. So I really, really appreciate that. One thing that really struck me when we were able to visit you was the volume of food that you were producing and the innovations that you were using on the farm and the impact that gave to the community. So access to food and what that looked like. Can you share a little bit of that with us, please?
Yeah. So that's a really great question. I think that's one part of food sovereignty, is that food security is one of the goals of food sovereignty, and that means you've got to produce a lot of food. Like, if we're going to feed everybody, or mostly everybody, or produce, like, say 80% of our calorie needs, it's a lot. Like, you take your population times it by 2,000 pounds, and that's your approximate need for local food production. If the highways for all get taken out, right? So for us, our target is like 20,000 pounds a year, which is low, but is significantly higher than a lot of First Nations, community gardens and things like that. And then in the innovation, I mean, our goal is to feed people, so a lot of that happens through innovative techniques and technologies that can accelerate food production. And it's probably not what you're thinking. Like when I say that, a lot of people think, oh, aquaponics or hydroponics or, fancy robotics. And no. We're just kind of going back to basics here where we're using like a raised bed maker behind a tractor that shapes all your beds and lays down all your irrigation and all your mulch and everything all in one pass, like kind of pretty standard stuff that you just don't see a lot of around here. But you produce an incredible volume of food in 1 year. You don't have to wait multiple years to get that up and running. So yeah, greenhouses are great simple things that can be made more efficient and can produce more food. Localizing your compost, we do that, and we've completely stopped buying outside inputs because we make it all ourselves now on the farm from local wastes, and it works fantastic. So yeah, there's a lot of things like just when I talk innovation, we do it from a food sovereignty lens, which is like how can we reduce our reliance on outside inputs and adopt innovative technologies that allows us to scale this up quickly and produce a lot of food for not a lot of money. That's the other thing too, is it can't be expensive.
We have a question from Diane.
Hi, this isn't the line of seminar that I was expecting at all. Very interesting though, and I am not Indigenous, and I did not realize there was such a huge blockade about the borrowing for you. But as far as food sustainability goes, you don't have to look at a large landmass or something. People can do it on a much smaller scale. Like I do container gardening because I'm old and I can't get down on the earth anymore, and it saves a lot of water. I have to use rainwater for my plants, but I think you could maybe encourage people to do it like on a smaller scale, even if they can't get land, not to be discouraged by it, but like start off with a few pots and grow from there. And it's surprising what you can grow in a very, very small area. And then the more cooperation you get, of course, the more sustainability and more efficiency we have. But it was a very good seminar. Thank you, ladies and men.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And to be clear, we do that. So we teach container growing. We teach, actually a huge highlight of our training is we teach people how to convert their yards into high food production areas. And that's where all our training starts. So we actually start with practical technologies and techniques that you can do right at home. That's where everybody starts. And then the more advanced levels is moving up to larger scale. So I just want to be, I know we haven't had time to go into depth on everything, but to be clear, we do teach that, and that's where everybody starts. And that is the goal, that is the vision, to start with producing enough for your own family in your own yard. That's exactly what we do. Just a couple of questions in the chat here. What crops? So we're technically mixed vegetable. So we grow just about everything. We even grew a little bit of rye last year. And so, yeah, hot crops, cold crops, all different kinds of veggies. One of the big questions we get asked is, why don't you do animals? The answer is really simple. We don't have enough money. Anybody who does animals knows how expensive they are for infrastructure and feed, and we just can't afford it. So it's been part of our plan, and we hope to do it, when resources allow. But for the time being, when we do train people in like ranching and animal, farming. So we have partner ranchers and farms very near us, and that's where we go for that training right now.
Okay, we have Kara and then Harvey.
Thanks. That was so amazing. I wanted to do a little work in the background, but I couldn't look away. So I just like encouraged that toolkit idea. I'm kind of on a similar idea, but for like rural food producers where, the same trend applies. We're losing farmers across the country, across Alberta. We're losing people out of rural communities, and that knowledge is, it's just disappearing overall. So I will look forward to seeing what you guys do with the toolkit idea. And then my other question is, I'm paying attention to the funding, like coming from the government, the federal and the provincial government. From the federal government, they do have this agri-diversity funding where they're encouraging like underrepresented people to get into agricultural careers. But it's like, it seems like just a performative kind of inclusion because, okay, well, we want you to have more skills, but you can't do anything with it because you can't, the funding and all the stuff that you talked about. So I guess like, what do you think about that kind of a program where they're encouraging, but it's not really effective? But also like, would you even apply for that funding? Because you can use it to build educational resources and stuff too.
Yeah, we did apply for it. So we apply for everything we possibly can, and it's insane. So great question. It's a can of worms. I'll open it up a little bit. So currently, First Nations and Indigenous funding in this country is highly politicized. It isn't about making a difference on the ground. It's about the government looking like they're making a difference to taxpayers and voters. That's all it is. So the way the formulas currently work right now is there's no real tests of indigeneity, for example, or First Nations or grassroots. There's very simple ones around like ownership. But so what you'll end up happening is a lot of those funds, the money doesn't go to First Nations or Indigenous people. It goes to non-First Nations people, nearly 100%. So this is how this works, is you'll have a privileged, well-resourced entity or institution that looks at that fund and goes, hey, I like money. I'll go find a First Nations partner and create a limited partnership where they are the owners, 51% owners, but they have zero control. So they'll be the limited partner, we'll be the general partner that does everything and gets all the money. And that's how it currently works. And then the government gets to say, hey, we gave the money to this First Nation, but it didn't actually go to that First Nation. It went to this other, institution or company. That's the standard model currently. And so we apply for all that money. And because I'm an entrepreneur and I'm private, I'm the very last on the list for government funders, because I'm not a political entity, I'm not a treaty government, I'm not a First Nation. And their main priority is to go check, look how many treaty governments we funded, look how many First Nations bands we funded, or First Nations organizations. So yes, we apply. So we've applied this year for 10 million across different funds, and we keep track of the spreadsheet, and we've maybe landed 200,000. Like it's a nightmare. And we started the fundraising. I have a full-time program developer who used to be my farmer and one of my teachers and program managers, and all he does is fundraise. And we basically fundraise for 8 months. We end up landing enough money to run for 2 to 3 months, and then we try and stretch that out to be a whole year. So I like to tell people we're really good at magically multiplying dollars and bootstrapping things and stretching things. So that's how the funding works. It's not a good situation. Like we had last year, just funding that we know of, we had $3 million raised in our name that never got to us. So and that's one of my risks with doing these presentations, is somebody on here is like, wow, Tea Creek's a great idea, I think I'll use it for my own fundraising. And that $3 million did not go to First Nations, it went to non-Indigenous. So that's how it's currently working, is that an institution can be like, hey, Tea Creek's really cool, let's tell the funder we're going to hire them, or we're going to use them, or we're going to adopt their model, it's Indigenous, it's awesome. The funder's like, okay, we'll fund it, and then they don't use us, they don't hire us, they don't get a penny of it. So, and that's really common, unfortunately, more so in agricultural funding than in non-agricultural funding. It's deeply biased against us.
Thank you, Kara. Harvey?
Yeah, well, I wanted to reiterate what Kara and others have said. Thank you for a marvelous presentation. You're speaking the truth, and all the truths are not easy to hear as an old settler, but they're absolutely truth. We farm and I'm also involved with the Keepers of the Water as a settler elder, and the same struggles with water, trying to get Safe Drinking Water Foundation practices, which was originally traditionally based in Saddle Creek and so on. It's really hard. It gets away on you, and again, the big firms, the big engineering firms, they want to stay with the chlorine and the industrial methods, and are not prepared to listen to the more tried and true traditional natural methods. But I guess in addition to thanking, I want to say that it'd be wonderful if you could come over. I'm sure you're spread too thin, but come over to Alberta. And I'm thinking the Keepers of the Water or other groups could host it. We did a little bit of work with renewables, so we helped get some solar going in a couple of the communities here, the First Nations, and now they've run with it. And I don't know exactly where Derek is from, but I know at mccac, they have some marvelous things going on with installing solar and so on. So I think we need the same thing with agriculture. That and again, there's only one of you out there, but again, that's the sort of spreading the good word is what we need. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for raising the issue of water, Harvey. I mean, it's one of the things that it should be this one thing we can all agree on, right? Like how important water is. Like water is life, no matter, like, period, full stop. And it's the thing that drives me crazy in agriculture is how important water is, and how that importance of water isn't reflected in government policies across other ministries. So you can be a farmer here in BC and want to pump water out of the creek to irrigate, and you'll apply and do everything right, and you'll get rejected nearly 100% of the time. And yet the forestry companies upstream can pump water no problem out of the creek. The mining companies can do it. They can clear cut an entire watershed that dries up your creeks and your aquifer because nobody's thinking about it in forestry. So when I go and speak to the government here, I'm like, guys, like water's got to be the backbone of, along with Indigenous rights and reconciliation, it's got to be a backbone of government policy, because you keep doing things the way you're going to do it, and we're all in serious trouble. So we work with our hereditary leaders here, here the people who have title to the land, Indigenous people, are hereditary leaders. And so they're on side totally with what we're doing, 100%. And they're actively working to protect the watershed that's upstream from our farms, so that we continue to have water. So what that means is limiting, in our case, it means limiting the clear cut logging that's on our water, on our basically our creek that feeds our farm. So
and fracking and I mean, water is a real crisis, particularly here in Alberta now. The wildfires ran through here, and of course through BC last year, but there's no moisture here. The old man dam in the southern Alberta that feeds the big irrigation farms, it's essentially dry. We fought it years ago, so we're in trouble, and
we are,
and so. And I'm sure that the First Nations people in southern Alberta are not at the top of the priority to get what's left. But anyway, again, thank you so much. Wonderful.
You're welcome. It's one of the single biggest things here in BC that can be done to impact water is forest practices being revised, because a lot of people see forest for the trees, understandably so, like myself included up until recently. And I've since learned that the water holding of soil, like the sponge ability of the soil, rests in basically your grasses and shrubs. So like your small vegetation, not your big vegetation. So when they replant here in BC, they just replant trees, and you go in and the forest floor has got no life on it. And then it, you get big rains and Abbotsford happens, right? Like everybody floats down the valley, on their rooftops. And that's a direct result of forest practices. Like we can do things to make ourselves more resilient, like planting aspen stands around our farms and our communities, because aspen is like a poplar is like a asbestos to wildfires, and it's one of the first species to be killed by Roundup here in BC by forestry companies. And then increasing the water holding of soils. There's another question I see in the chat about Indigenous communities traveling to Tea Creek. Yeah, so I mean, part of our big plan is, Tea Creek University is having, dormitories, accommodation right on site. In the meantime, we have 2 houses that we purchased, which our First Nations are able to rent if they're sending people from far away. So those were fully booked last year, and yeah, it's quite popular. I see another question. Did I miss in this background? Where did you get your horticultural knowledge? That's a great question. So the answer is going to probably surprise you. I got it mostly off YouTube, but I also got it by traveling and visiting like amazing farms and food producers. So I've got a friend down in the United States who's a award-winning producer down in Oregon. So I went down there and stayed with him for a couple of weeks, beginning of season, end of season, and then I toured around these other phenomenal operations. And that's really where I got inspired. Like, to be honest, I was just like, oh my God, like seeing the innovation and the fact that these were all small scale, like his is under, I think he's got like 4 or 5 acres, but 2 acres of production. And he's feeding his family, making money, paying his workers a good wage. Like, that's the other thing that blew me away. I'm like, and without government subsidies of any kind, I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And then I went and visited a bunch of others. And yeah, it was really fascinating. Like, one of them, talking about horticulture knowledge, was like a 6th generation tree person, orchardist. And I remember him standing in his orchard with him, and he's looking at the trees. He said, we've done it all wrong. 5 generations, we were doing it wrong. He's like, it's all about the soil. It's all about soil health. He's like, so every time I was spraying my fruit trees, I was killing the soil and then killing the ability of the ecosystem to fight back against disease and challenges like lack of water. And so so it completely flipped around for him. And he was showing me how he was basically stewarding the soil and the land so that his fruit trees would be more resilient and more productive and more profitable. And it was working. And I was just like, mind blown, right? So it's a mix of like online and going and seeing it in person is where I get my knowledge. And then the other thing is, it comes to me, especially with how busy Tea Creek is, the amount of knowledge I've picked up from, elders and visitors and people who will just drop a knowledge bomb on me, and I'll be like, what the heck? And then I'll go research it. I'll buy books. I've got a little library of books, and I'll, ground truth it a bit before I start sharing it. So that one part of the story of my slideshow about it being grassland here was actually a settler, like a 5th generation settler, who came and was like, hey, my great grandmother was one of the first settlers who came here. And before she died, she pulled me aside and said, what you believe isn't true. Like, Indigenous people here were farmers, ranchers. Like, when we moved here, this whole valley was grassland. There was no forest. I was like, what? So that's how it comes to me. And then I went and started talking to Indigenous elders, and they all confirmed it. And I was like, what the heck is going on? Like, we're all believing that we're all like forest dwelling moose hunters, and here we're like field food producers traditionally. Like it was a complete shock. Okay, another question. How many acres do you have? So Tea Creek's a quarter section, so it's 160 acres. We actively use, I think it's 6 acres of it. The rest is like essentially food forest. So it's an old meeting site, First Nations meeting site. It's where 4 different First Nations roads met. And so there's an old food forest there that's kind of radiated out, and very, very, very diverse and healthy forest. Very cool. And then we have an additional 300 or so acres that we've have on top of that main quarter section of old grain production, actually. So here, back in the old days, before the highway came in, everybody used to grow grain, and there used to be a mill on the river, like an old-fashioned water wheel mill with a grindstone, and people used to bring their grain and make their own flour and bake their own bread.
Okay, is there any other questions from the group? Okay, Jill, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I have to reiterate how much I've learned and how much I think it just opens doors for many different conversations. And we have some people on the call here that we've started a lot of communication and discussion about food sovereignty, and we keep coming back to the importance of connection between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And what you shared about the barriers that you have and other Indigenous people have, being aware of many of those barriers, not all of them, obviously. But again, it comes down to how do we all progress that and make changes for those barriers. So it really sparked a lot of inspiration in that way. So thank you so much, and just want to thank everybody again for joining us on this call. I'm going to pop into the chat just a piece about this webinar was made possible by our funders, so the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. So just wanted to give acknowledgement to them and their support. And we do have another webinar coming up on the evening of the 23rd, and we'll be sending out to everybody who's registered here, and would welcome Jacob if you're available. It's with the Treaty Land Sharing Network. So yeah, so thank you again so much, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you all. I just have one closing comment here, Jill, just kind of something you've touched on, and that is yeah, the barriers, but there's flip side is the opportunity. Like why do we need to care, beyond social justice and setting things right? The reason is that this country needs Indigenous people. It's in serious trouble with worker, farmer, food producer shortages that are just growing and growing and growing, and Indigenous people are the only growing segment of the Canadian population outside of immigration. It's also by far the youngest, and it's got the most fire in their belly, and it's the best investment to make. And unfortunately, that's not the policy of this country currently. It's the opposite. So I just want to leave with that. Like, this is the best possible policy this country could make in the area of economic resiliency and food production. We all need it, and we need it now. So just encourage you, if you've got any influence or ability, to put some pressure on policymakers and decision makers to stop throwing good money after bad, and start investing where it needs to be and where it makes most sense, which is in Indigenous peoples of this country. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hi.